though a debt ceiling deal seems to be edging closer, according to various media reports, it seems any agreement could involve a cap on federal spending for 2 years. Joining us for the latest is Dionne Jr, Brookings Institution Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and a columnist at the Washington Post. Thank you so much for being here, EJ. So we're getting these reports and maybe they're getting a little bit closer to a deal here. And you wrote a recent column at what the cost will be, not just sort of in dollars and cents, but from a bigger sort of philosophical perspective, what the cost will be. From what you've seen of this current reporting, what do you think we're going to end up with here?
Well, I wrote that column because I was very worried that almost all of these cuts were going to come out of programs mostly for lower income Americans and some middle class Americans. And it just seemed very odd to me that you are going to have, with all the money that the federal government spent, by narrowing the options of what could be cut to what is blandly called domestic discretionary spending. A lot of those programs, whether in childcare or healthcare or housing, go to people who need the money most. So, no possible closing of tax loopholes for rich people, nothing else but these cuts. If you look at these deals, and you've seen a bit of a revolt this week among House Democrats who were very upset with President Biden for letting Kevin McCarthy, the House Speaker, really dominate the public debate. And the president hung back, didn't say much except that the talks are going well. The news last night about the contours of the deal, if it holds, I think will hearten some of the people who worried about big cuts. It looks like the cuts will be limited to 2 years. There will be a 2-year debt ceiling increase, which, as you suggested in the opener, is central to saving the economy, preventing a potential economic catastrophe. By shuffling some money around, taking $10 billion out of the increase that was going to the IRS to increase collections from mostly the best off, they've taken some of the edge off the cuts. So my suspicion is that if this is the deal, Biden and House leaders will be able to deliver enough Democrats for the deal. However, there is a real revolt on the right and far right of the Republican caucus against the deal. And the math is very tricky. What pretty much everybody I talk to says is that if you're going to pass a Biden-McCarthy deal in the House, you're going to need about 150 Democratic votes and Republican votes and 70 Democratic votes. That just barely gets you to a majority. If you lose a few either on your right or on your left, the deal might not pass. So they're going to be navigating this tricky math right to the end.
EJ, I want to ask you a follow-up question to your point in your column about the poor being held hostage in this debt ceiling standoff. One of the sticking points has been this work requirements piece. And you say this is not a partisan issue, but it seems like the way it's being approached is a partisan issue, whereas Republicans are in favor of this, but the Biden administration not in favor of this. Do you see them reaching some sort of agreement on this particular sticking point?
Right. Well, I agree with you that this is a partisan issue. What I wrote was to describe this as cut programs for the poor and avoid tax increases on the rich. That's not a partisan description. That's what's going on. But you're quite right. This is the final sticking point. And I hate even to use the words work requirements, because these requirements are not designed to help people get jobs. Very few people would get jobs. What they really are is an attempt to build red tape around programs, make it harder for people to access them by putting in these complicated requirements that are labeled work requirements. And the result of them, depending on what they look like in the end, would be that a lot of people who work, who are eligible for these programs, might not get them because they'd have trouble jumping through all the bureaucratic hoops to get Medicaid or food stamps or temporary assistance to the poor. That is where the Biden folks and the Republicans are negotiating very hard at the end. The Biden folks are trying to eliminate or at least minimize, maybe make the work requirements some fig leaf that McCarthy can declare a victory but don't really do much, versus very substantial work requirements. And, I mentioned that 150-70 math. I think a lot of Democratic votes, not just on the left of the party, but a lot of mainstream Democrats really do not like the way these so-called work requirements would work. So I think the administration wants to fight hard to the end to say to Democrats, we tried to minimize these so-called work requirements.
EJ, I've been talking for a few days now about how sort of idiotic this whole process is, right? And every time it rolls around, we kind of shrug and say, oh, here we go again. Is there any realistic way of fixing this for the next time and the time after that and the time after that? Is it just like, this is partisan politics, there's nothing we can do, or is there actually something that could be done?
Right. We shouldn't have a debt ceiling. There's only one other country in the world that has a debt ceiling, Denmark, and they set it so high that it really doesn't matter. And the only reason we have a debt ceiling was because of politics around borrowing for World War I. Remember, World War I, not even World War II. And it was a long time ago. And for various reasons at the time, it was easier for the government to borrow politically if there was a debt ceiling. And then we've stuck with this for all these years. Before politics was so polarized, it didn't matter that much. There was always a little skirmishing around the debt ceiling. But until 2011, when the then Republican House majority mobilized it against President Obama, we hadn't had these problems. We should repeal the debt ceiling. Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, once had a proposal giving the president power to override it. None of this happened. I think President Biden would have been better off to try to get something like this through the last Congress where there was a Democratic majority. They figured they weren't going to be able to get it passed, and it would have been difficult. But the debt ceiling is an idiotic idea because Congress can spend all the money it wants. It incurs these debts, and then they have to vote again. It's like you're running up a credit card bill, although I'm sure you wouldn't do that, but you're running up a credit card bill and then saying, well, I can't pay it because I have this provision that puts a ceiling on how much debt I can accumulate after you have all the goods in your house or have taken all your vacations. It's crazy.
I like that analogy there, EJ. And one more question for you with kind of what we're hearing about the timeline. They're getting apparently closer to a deal and reportedly expecting for this to extend the timeline now out to 2024. To Julie's point earlier, is this really just kicking the can down the road for the next administration, whoever that would be, or past 2024 really, to deal with?
Well, it is true that it's kicking it down the road, but, this is a road where this is a can I really want kicked down the road. I think everybody, your viewers who are investors really want it kicked down the road. So I think it would be a big deal if it were extended that far. Your premise is right. We shouldn't, I don't think we should have a debt ceiling, so we shouldn't have to go through this again. But at the moment, there are not the votes to get rid of a debt ceiling. So 2 years is the best we can do right now. And if it happens, I'll take it because I prefer that to cratering the global economy.
Right. To there being no deal. Exactly. All right. Our thanks to you, EJ Dionne, Brookings Institution Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and Washington Post columnist. We appreciate you.